Um, we'll get started. Good afternoon, East Coast, Quebec, Ontario coaches, and Midwest and Western coaches. Good morning. My name is Carol Love, and today I'm facilitating the Rowing Canada's webinar. And the topic today is long-term vision for long-term success. We have our presenters, Jordan Clarke and Dane Lawson. Jordan is a Rowing Canada NextGen Sports Science and Sport Medical Lead. And Dane Lawson is a Rowing Canada NextGen Hub coach with the Western Hub. And they're ready to share with you the principles and value of skill development and training, learning how to do the right things at the beginning, and this will drive our long-term success. Now, this session is being recorded, and please place your questions and comments in the question and answer column. We'll get to as many of these as we can towards the end. We have 45 minutes. We've got some incredibly talented coaches online today too, listening in, always wanting to know what's happening. So thank you for everybody, and over to you, Jordan and Dane.
All right. I don't know if you can hear my background noise, but if the kids upstairs are a little noisy, I apologize. The realities of working from home right now. Just up front, the objective of today is talking about what is important early on in an athlete's development to maximize potential in the long term. We had a couple of pre-webinar questions that were more about reviewing the NextGen system and things like that, which not what we're trying to get to, but more how do we keep a long-term view of the athlete's pathway, so the next few years of this athlete's development in our minds as we're programming maybe for this high school season or the summer season or things like that. What things are important to keep in mind that are going to be important for that athlete long-term. I selected these pictures here because if you look at that first group, that's the repeating under 23 women's 8 champions. And 8 of those 9 athletes have spent time in the senior center now, either in the Olympic or Paralympic camp. And 7 of the 9 are still there. And you can see in the lower picture that some of them are there on the World Cup podium. So that's really what we're talking about. It's not necessarily about winning the race at the age group level. It's how do we get them to convert and keep having success as they progress through their career, and what are kind of the foundational pieces for those athletes. So just up front, I wanted to talk about the concept of athlete preparedness versus athlete readiness. So for me, the preparedness is when we're talking about the development of the necessary skills and the characteristics required for performance. It's not necessarily about being able to perform right now. So these are things like, learning to take the stroke properly. Do they have enough muscle mass? Do they have enough strength and power? Do they have an aerobic system capable of the outputs that are needed? And contrasted with readiness, which is really the athlete's ability to use the things they've developed through their training and their career and maybe their genetically predisposed characteristics, and optimally express those skills and characteristics that they've worked so hard to develop on the day at the right time, kind of a performance on demand type scenario. So in a timeline of an athlete's development from learn to row to the Olympics, up front, it should be very heavily on the preparedness. We're not worried about getting someone new to the sport to optimize their skills and their physiology to race in a couple of weeks. That shouldn't be the focus. It should be about developing their skill set and developing the capacity for performance. And then, as you progress through your career, not everyone makes it to the Olympics, obviously, but maybe a high school athlete, it's in the fall and the winter, they're really, skewed towards the preparedness. And then as they get, into the high school racing season in the spring, readiness becomes a bit more. Like, you do want to have success at the races you're doing throughout your career. It's not just about, you don't want to win your first race at the Olympics. It would be kind of cool if that was possible. you want to win because winning's fun, and it helps people stay in the sports. So there is aspects of readiness, but in my view, for a development athlete, much more of the year should be spent, attacking the concept of preparedness and capacity rather than readiness. And I think something that I've observed in the rowing development system, the club system, is sometimes, particularly with volunteer coaches who might only coach a chunk of the year, we can get caught in the cycle sometimes of getting ready for the next big race. So whether you come in as the high school coach and your job is to get them ready for CSSRA, and then they have a summer coach whose job is to get them ready for Henley, and then they come back in the fall and they've got a coach who's really targeting head of the Charles or something like that, or NRCs, right? And it's like you get these little chunks where, okay, we've only got this short period of time to get ready, and maybe we prioritize some of the readiness type training over making sure we're really putting in the blocks that, maybe in 6 weeks we won't be as fast, but in 6 months we'll be a little bit faster. In a year, if we do this, we're going to be definitely faster than the people who focus on readiness, and taking that long-term view of what training today is going to not necessarily make me faster, the fastest in 3 weeks that I can possibly be, but the fastest in 3 years that I can possibly be, or the fastest in 10 years, depending on what we're talking about. So today we're really talking about the training strategy philosophy that kind of guides the programs that we write and the athletes we work with. And so it's really about prioritizing the attributes that need to be developed. A lot of you hopefully recognize this as coming from Peter Shakespeare's work, who's definitely a bit of a mentor for both of us. And it's basically the underlying principles that we've been working on for the last few years in the NextGen program, and refining and learning our own things about and trying to add that into there. So the structure that we're going to follow is we're going to outline what the principle is, the why that's an important principle, the how you actually do that in your program, and then what if it's wrong? What if you trust us or trust Peter and you implement this type of training and we're wrong? Like you did it, you do 6 months of it and we're wrong. What's the downside to that? And then for some of the principles, we've got okay, if you don't do it, but we're right, what's the counter risk?
So I'm just going to pick up on the first one, which is integrating the athlete into the environment. So as we are getting the athletes situated, maybe this is day 1 to 7 of an athlete. So the first day they arrive at the boathouse, what are we doing to set them up for success? And really, the one principle that I keep coming back to in early stages is athlete comfort. And so it's just this integration piece. And it's really about doing the base work so an athlete knows how to show up, how to get on the water safely, how to be knowledgeable about the sport, and what does an athlete actually need to do to get better. So why we want to focus on this, in addition to just being safe with the person and the equipment, we want to open the athlete into the learning process. So they need to be an active participant in it, and the entire learning process is centered around things that creating the situation where the athlete can drive their learning. So even more than like the coach has a big impact, obviously, but we want to try and shift the learning more towards an athlete-driven approach, and get them thinking critically, and making sure that they are taking the steps that they need to row fast. So we also just want to develop a rapport with the athlete. So we want to be authentic to who we are as a coach, demonstrate our leadership capabilities, and just demonstrate that we're trustworthy individuals that care about their safety and their development. And we also just want to develop their rowing terms and make them knowledgeable about the sport. If they show up on day one, they can't row. So we've got to put them in situations where they're maybe a week down the road able to take some really, really good strokes from an early stage. Jordan, you want to click the next slide there? Okay, so when we have people in first time, this is, I think, pretty standard across all clubs, but I just wanted to mention it. Carrying the boat, spending increased time carrying the boat around, practicing going over heads, rolling it into the water, making sure that they know exactly what they need to, so that come day 3 or 4, that's just automatic. And all of a sudden, the coach doesn't need to worry about helping the athlete get on the water. Getting in the end of the boat, I think pretty self-explanatory. Kind of one of the big things for me is understanding a safety position. So this is kind of a default home base position where they can come back to and feel comfortable. In sculling, a lot of times that's going to be taking the handles, putting them together, and just finding a nice stable position with the blades resting flat on the water. And then in sweep, you would have to work within the crew to make sure that they're coming to the neutral position so the hands aren't too high or too low. Just a nice balanced set position where they can be comfortable. The next stage in teaching is some points of contact around the boat. And it just gets the athletes thinking about the environment around them, as well as getting them just outside their comfort zone, and willing to kind of explore the space around them. So for points of contact, we have them actually roll forward on the seat and touch a point on the stern deck to reach out and touch the oarlock, reach behind them, touch the bow deck. So that would be with the seat all the way back. And then the hard one, this is for sculling obviously, is to reach across and touch the opposite oarlock. And so not all of our athletes have long enough arms to just kind of span out and touch those oarlocks. So the first time that they try and reach across to that opposite oarlock, a lot of times the coach is greeted by, "I can't do this." So the athlete's like, "I can't reach that." Their arm is still several centimeters away. And we just give them the time to explore that. And you don't move on until they're able to actually reach across. So it may be just negotiating the hands, and that's where we can get into the hand skills and the grip. So showing them how to hold on to the handle correctly, feathering and squaring. And then the big one is capsizing. So typically, if you're teaching in the singles, you can push them off with a rope tied to the rigger or the side of the boat somehow, and just let them fall out of the boat, and kind of getting over that initial fear of falling into the water, assuming that it's you've taken some safety steps to make sure that that's going to be safe, it's not too cold, etc. Even the first time of just that act of falling in the water, they can just swim over to the dock and get up onto the dock. But then you want to teach them the steps to how do you get back in the boat. And it's going to be a process that you want to teach. So it involves first getting the handles together, getting the handles down to the gunnels. Then they're going to pop themselves into the boat, make sure that their butt gets onto the seat deck, bring the leg across, and then lift the handles so they're in that safety position and they're once again stable. So we just want to introduce that process. And kind of a good benchmark for getting back in the boat after capsizing is within a minute, and that's a good indication that they're comfortable and kind of ready to move on. The risks of not working on the comfort, the risk of this approach, it does take things pretty slowly. It's not going to feel like they're rowing. They're not going to be rowing for the first period of time. They may take some little strokes and just figure out how to maneuver, but it's definitely a slow approach. There are always going to be athletes that don't like to capsize. And that's just a very real aspect of the stroke, or of the sport. But you also want to monitor their reaction to flipping, and it may just be a case where the sport doesn't line up with them. It is also very time consuming for a coach. You've got to be willing to make an investment in that athlete, and we don't all have unlimited time and resources to put towards that.
All right, here we go. Yeah, the second principle is balance before technique. So obviously prioritizing being able to set the boat up and be balanced and comfortable, manipulating the boat before trying to teach the right sequence, the blade entry and body sequence and things like that. So why is this an important principle? It obviously provides a stable platform for the athlete to learn in. Makes things a little bit more repeatable. So obviously rolling up the slide and flopping side to side makes it hard to start to learn where the water is and where your hands need to be and things like that. By going through the process of working on their balance, it's going to give them some confidence. So those people who don't like to capsize are going to feel a little bit more comfortable that they've got a bit more control and that they can go to some of those extreme positions and pull it back, which leads them to relax. And relaxation is an important part of good technique. So it gives them that ability to not be over tense and find good positions later on and find good rhythm. Allows consistency when practicing technique. And then the concept of open and closed learning. So the fewer variables that we present someone with, the simpler the task becomes to learn. So if are out there trying to row and just like you put them in the boat first day and tell them to row away from the dock, they've got a lot of new things coming at them. Odds are their strokes don't look like the stroke you want them to have. And I mean, that's one way for them to start to develop balance and things like that. But then they're also taking less than ideal strokes and are learning those less than ideal strokes. So the more closed, fewer variables we can give them early on, the better their learning is going to be for those positions and sequence and things like that that we want them, blade work, we want them to develop over time. So some of the how, do a lot of balance skills and drills, and Dane's going to take us through that.
Do you want to go to that next slide? So this is just a sample sheet of some of the skills that you want to start with, or that you can consider adding to your repertoire. I think really the fun part about coaching in this very early stage of development is you can experiment and just do a whole host of different exercises, and you can make them up and you can find kind of what works for your coaching style, and then also what you find helpful from the rower's perspective. And really the mark is when you're observing this, you want to watch when they're able to execute the points just completely fearlessly, especially when you get into the competition aspect. So you can start these early days, maybe the first or second time they're on the water, and then you can just keep a running tally. I just keep a note on my phone with different exercises and what their personal best is. So that's either time or number of repetitions in 30 seconds or something like that. And they'll start off very tentative, but once you get going, they're just looking to improve on a day-to-day basis with the number of repetitions they can perform or the amount of time that it takes. Actual practical examples of what I like to work on with balance is the manipulation of the handle heights. And so really understanding the difference between stability and set. So for set, it's a very narrow definition. It's what most people think of when they understand balance. And that's just kind of like a position where the oarlocks are at the exact same height. So the boat is nice and set and level. Whereas stability can be any point at which there's like an equilibrium of the system. So one of my favorite ways to demonstrate that is having them put one of their handles in sculling right down to the gunnel, and then letting go of that handle. And when they appreciate the fact that the boat can be very unlevel, but they can be in a stable position, that's, I think, a really good key for them to understand that there's a large range of what balance means. So some of the exercises that we really work on in order to develop the balance is going to be things like bobbing at various parts of the stroke. So we always start at the finish just because it's pretty easy and comfortable, but getting the understanding of the hands coming up and the blades coming out of the water. And that's followed by bobbing and then pausing with the blades out of the water, and trying to hold that position and hold that balance. One of the ones that I really like is handle dips. So that's where they go up to the catch. And what we have them do is keep the blades flat on the water and then start to lean to one side. So the boat reaches an equilibrium on one side. And then with their opposite hand, they're going to dip that handle in the water. And it's a great way in a pretty unstable position up at the catch position to learn this idea that the boat can be unbalanced and that it can actually still be stable. If they're doing an exercise like turning 360 degrees, look for their boat to be set as they turn, so there's not massive fluctuations in their boat set. And then a pretty classic one is roll-ups, where we're just taking a recovery and then placing the blades either flat or square up at the catch position.
So the risk of believing this system and doing this and implementing is, I mean, you're just going to delay rowing and maybe fitness gains slightly. My personal view is that you're probably going to make up for that pretty fast and probably exceed the fitness gains, because you're going to be hopefully learning to row and taking off a lot better than you would have been if you don't work on the balance up front. Risk of the opposite way. You learn poor technique or poor positions. You learn to compensate for things because the boat's not balanced. Don't get comfortable, don't get confident, particularly in small boats. Have a harder time learning technique. It's more frustrating. It's not as enjoyable. You start to ingrain poor habits, like maybe using your body to help correct and find some stability rather than learning to balance the boat. And eventually you're going to have to go back and learn in the future. So if you're worried about delaying the rowing and the fitness gains, you're going to have to invest time later where it's probably more important to be working on the fitness, and invest that time learning how to balance the boat properly and get control of the boat, potentially. Next principle is posture, core, flexibility before load. So really this comes down to, originally I had this down as an injury risk perspective. So if we're loading and you're not in a good, strong, stable, healthy position, we're obviously increasing your chance that the load is going to lead to an injury, either acutely or chronically. So the focus is about the ability to move properly before we challenge that ability to move by applying load on top of it. More recently, I've come to think of it as just fundamentally addressing whether the athlete can actually do the skills you're trying to coach. So if there's a physical limitation to the athlete rocking over from their hips, or getting into certain positions at the catch or the finish or somewhere in between that you're trying to get them to do, but they don't physically possess the ability, either from their anatomy or some other kind of block. Doesn't matter what drills you do, doesn't matter what cue you give them, they just can't physically do it. So if those things exist, like a ankle mobility or hip mobility or something like that, those things aren't just going to go away if we ignore them. So assessing, for some people it is just simply a movement pattern, or they have to learn how to do it properly. So if we assess them up front and check those things, and decide whether or not we need to do an intervention to find that flexibility or work on the core so that they can hold their posture in those positions and own those positions. It's just going to make everything better down the line. So why is this an important principle? So as I said, just having the physical ability to take the stroke properly gives them the ability to learn correct positions and shapes, so body shapes, movement patterns, while they're learning. So if you don't take the kid who's got no hip hinge ability and teach him how to do that, he's going to learn and ingrain the pattern where he gets that flexion from his lumbar spine instead. And it's going to be really hard when he gets somewhat fast to get him to slow down and fix that and change that pattern. And again, you're going to have to stop training to really make those changes later on. So you might as well do it up front while it's not as important, so that all the training that follows is even more effective. We know longevity is important in this sport. You need to develop a high level of skill, which can take time, and the efficiency and economy that comes with putting in the thousands and thousands of kilometers that our Olympians generally put in before they're ready to win. Consistency. So a huge thing is not missing big chunks of time because you're injured. And getting rid of those interruptions to training and progress, right? People that make really good progress for 6 months and then spend 2 months dealing with an injury and then have to try to catch back up to that level adds up over time, versus maybe you had a bit of a slower growth and you never get that interruption. You'll end up taking more strokes in the long run by staying healthy. And by getting into proper shapes and positions and doing things in a more biomechanically favorable way, you increase the tolerance for load. So if I'm in a nice, strong posture and I'm squatting, my body's can handle more load than if I'm in a poor posture and I put the same amount of weight on my back and try to squat. The same load is less likely to hurt me or lead to tissue damage or tissue failure when I'm in a good position compared to maybe a compromised position. So how do we do this? Early on and at all times, in my opinion, prioritizing the quality of the movement over the outcome. So particularly on an erg, on a concept 2, or even an RP3, or even in the boat, really. Doing it right is better than doing it fast until we get to that point where it's, readiness is and outcome is the most important thing. So I'd much rather my rower row ugly and fast at the Olympics than beautifully and slow. But when we're learning and developing, trying to create those patterns that are going to allow good looking, fast rowing, and higher quality rowing being the most important thing, should be the priority. If we need to, and we're at a level where we need to keep training at a high level, building fitness through cross training, and really insisting that proper technique on the erg in the boat is going to happen. So examples of this is you got a 90-minute session, the athlete starts to break down after 40 minutes or half an hour on the erg, and the technique is just not, they can't pull it back. Either go throw them on a spin bike, go for a run, do something different. You can come back to the erg and maybe a little bit of a break from the pattern has helped them. Or you just finish the session via cross training. You're still getting your physiology in, your lungs are still your lungs, your heart's your heart. Those things aren't necessarily as discerning to the mode as we'd like to think sometimes. So we can continue to build fitness while insisting on good quality movement. Committing time to mobility and core work. So some athletes are great and they'll take this on their own. Some of them maybe take it too far. But if your athletes you can't trust them to do it on their own, then taking time in the sessions you have to do it. And again, it's something that just maybe takes away in the short term from what you'd rather spend that 20 minutes rowing. But I think a long-term payoff when you don't have to take that 20 minutes to do this anymore. All the other minutes rowing are just going to be better. And then another how that I know I've had this discussion with Mike Person. I think he's discussed this in some presentations before, or starting to talk about it more, is, why don't we adjust the rigging more to help people who struggle to get into good positions? And so you think about like cycling, we do bike fittings to make people make sure that their bike is set up for them to optimize power outputs and comfort and things like that. So if there's things like raising the seat, like putting pucks under the seat or lowering the feet or making some adjustments to help people learn the kind of positions their body's supposed to be in. And then as we, increase ankle mobility and do all those other things, we start lifting the feet up slowly over time and start getting back to a more standard rigging or more optimal rigging as far as force vectors and things. I think it's an important area that we probably need to explore a little bit more and maybe do a little bit more. Again, the risk of trusting this and implementing this is maybe you fall behind in fitness, but again, it's more maybe in the specificity of rowing that you might fall behind. But I think very quickly you can get a payoff where you start to get ahead. The risk if you don't worry about posture, core, and flexibility and the actual ability to take the stroke properly and just start loading, you're likely, or more likely, I guess, to get injured and fall behind in fitness later, which again, the further down your timeline, potentially the more consequential time off or time away from gaining fitness can be. So like an injury going into the summer where you're targeting being on the under-23 team, if you spend that 6-week camp on the physio table, you're probably not going to have much success at the championship. Repetitive loading at the end range of any tissue is an increase for risk, particularly low back. So if you have a hard time rocking over and you're taking those strokes with a less than ideal curvature of your spine, and you're loading that, you're definitely increasing the risk of low back injuries. Increased risk of rib injuries if you're not loading things properly. Potentially reinforcing problems with movement patterns, and then jeopardizing the most important ability in any sport is availability. If you're super fit but you're not available for the race, it's all for nothing. And then ultimately, if someone does have a block where they don't know how to hinge at their hips, they don't know how to engage their glutes, they don't have ankle mobility due to soft tissue restrictions, things that could be addressed. If you never take the time to address it, you're never going to get rid of it. So they may make it all the way to the national team with really stiff ankles that impacts their ability to get into a good strong catch position, or they may not hinge well from their hips, which, when you get to that level where you're putting that kind of load on your body, the more compromised your positions are, the more likely the injury is going to pop up. The next one is power before endurance. So when I first put this presentation together a few years ago, and before I modified it, I thought of this more about doing the intensive work being more important than the extensive work. So developing the power at VO2 max is more important than the aerobic capacity work. And not that you don't do the aerobic capacity work, but what ultimately determines your outcome is what your aerobic power is, not what your aerobic capacity is. But through working with Dane in the last few years in the NextGen program and the other coaches, really started to come around to the idea that it's not just kind of the power outputs that we can row fast at, but it's how we're doing it. So the physiologist in me wants to think about the VO2 max power, but from a holistic view of power versus endurance, building the distance per stroke, the actual how the mechanics they're using to develop their power through the stroke, and the strength that they have being priorities over doing the extensive work. The why, so rowing's an aerobic power sport. It's not an pure endurance sport like a marathon or an ultra marathon. It requires really large power outputs. So if you don't have the ability to generate high horsepower, how are you ever going to sustain high horsepower over 2 kilometers? And from the literature and from what we've seen in our athletes, power at VO2 max is highly correlated to rowing performance. So in our elite athletes, their VO2 max, so the amount of oxygen per minute that they're able to consume, probably doesn't change a whole lot after a certain point, but the power outputs that they're able to achieve at that level of oxygen consumption do increase, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do. It's pretty close to what your 2K power is. So with that, it should be pretty clear why it's important. So how we do it, so we set key sessions within the week with the intent to develop power. The endurance sessions, so we'll show a program or the example of the program we're running through right now, and you'll see that there is a lot of endurance volume in there, but the key sessions are the ones where the athletes are working on developing that power. So the endurance sessions support, but they should not compromise those sessions. And we want the athletes to take effective, strong strokes before we worry about taking a lot of them. So some of the ways we do that are breaking high intensity or high quality sessions into manageable chunks, implementing strength training early on, hopefully not waiting till we're in university to pick up a weight for the first time. And I think something that's really important is both for the coach and then definitely for the athletes, understanding what good speeds actually are. I don't know if Dane wants to jump in with some of his experience in this area.
Yeah, kind of my main one that I've really been using over the last couple of years is that I just encounter a lot of athletes that kind of like will say, I'm just working on my technique, and they're just kind of like going through the stroke sequence very light. Oftentimes if it's on the erg, they're just looking in the mirror and they're just kind of moving back and forth. Really, technique is the application of power. And so if we're not developing our power through good, strong strokes that are focused on developing speed, we're not actually developing our technique. So some of the just quick exercises that we're doing, just from a standstill, can they do one stroke? So there is like a large technical component to producing power. It involves the sequence and the way that they interact with the equipment. So if they're up at the catch and they're taking one stroke, if you see right at the outset their hands lift up, they probably don't have a good understanding of balance, and they probably don't have a good understanding of drive mechanics. So what you want to use are the tools available to you. Not everyone has a buoyed course, but if you're up against a buoy line, trying to clear as many buoys as possible, if they're just steady rowing and trying to increase that clearance and they have a good relative marker beside them. On the GPS stroke coaches, they have a distance per stroke function, and you can use that to develop their power output. So rate stays the same, increased distance per stroke. Your impulse that you're providing is better, and that's what we're all about. A really effective exercise is 0 to 100, and this was really a core of Peter Shakespeare's program. And if I can just like jump in with a super quick anecdote, a couple of years ago, I was working with a junior men's double, and I had the opportunity to ride along in the coach boat with Shakes, and we were kind of struggling to hit like some target speeds at our category 2 intensity. So that would have been like right up at race rate at, you know, mid 30s. And so I was like, okay, well, we got to develop power. So we were working on our catches, working on developing that power, but not necessarily thinking about the technical aspect of the power. And so Shake stopped us, got us reset, asked us to execute this 0 to 100 drill. And when he actually asked them, so that's an exercise where at the catch, they try and put their blades in with no pressure and they're just trying to float. And the blade starts slowly. And then as we're coming through the drive, the pressure in the hands and the feet increase so that by the end of the stroke, when they're pulling in right at the finish, they're at 100% of their effort and their available power. And so he asked them what were they actually at in terms of, were they at 0? Were they at 100 at either end of the stroke? And they were like, oh no, it's probably like 50 to 70. And so he got on their case and was like, that's not what I asked you to do. So we retooled it and we actually accomplished the 0 to 100 or something much closer to it. And they hit their category 2 intensity speed, which was a 136 in a men's double. They hit it at 24 strokes per minute. So this is how the technical application of power is so important. So from a coaching perspective, we've got to have a good understanding of how to coach that power. So that 0 to 100 exercise, critically important. Even getting them to do 500 meters in as few strokes as possible. So low rate, biggest distance per stroke that they can accomplish, and then track if they're getting fewer strokes in the 500. And a good marker is, 25 strokes. And for some of the top male athletes, getting in like 15 strokes, maybe even lower. And of course, we want to just develop the range of low rates first before we worry about kind of moving on to those middle and high rates. Oh, you're muted, Jordan.
All right. So the risk of prioritizing developing, so this isn't necessarily that you don't do endurance while we're developing power. It's just that we prioritize developing our power over developing our endurance. So for me, so I made this slide 2 years ago. I still haven't come up with what a risk of doing it this way would be. So I still really believe in it. The risk of doing the opposite is you can get really good at going slow for a long time. Right? So if you don't ever develop your power and speed, and you take the speed that you're at and you do a lot of volume at that speed, you're not necessarily going to drive development of speed by going slow. And I mean, maybe worse is you put a lot of time and effort in doing that volume, and you don't really get an increase in what ultimately matters is performance over 2 kilometers. So you really got to drive the top end. So the benefit that we get out of volume is important. If you get efficiency and economy and you get some peripheral adaptation, those things all go into improving performance as well. But if you don't ever stress your cardiovascular system at the top level, it's not going to develop. And that's really the area of physiology that you actually need to be able to do those outputs for 5 to 8 minutes. The next principle, cognizant that we're now around 45 minutes, so we'll maybe speed this up a little bit. Automate before repetition and fatigue training. So the principle is basically being able to do it right without having to put too much thought and energy into what you're doing. So when someone's learning to take the stroke and they're really thinking about, okay, now I've got to do this next piece, but you want to get to that point where it's just like, this is just how I take a stroke. I don't really think about taking the stroke anymore. I'm just doing it and doing it right. So when the pattern is automated, it's going to require less of that cognitive energy to think about actually achieving a good stroke. And it's not that every stroke is perfect, and they don't have to think of like make adjustments of like, oh, that was a bad stroke, how do I fix it on the next one? But you want it to just become a little bit easier and a little bit less of a mental strain on the athlete before you really stress their ability to do that. So the pattern hasn't been really learned well or fully learned and kind of ingrained in their system. Doing long fatiguing sessions will lead to technical breakdown. So maybe I should have borrowed Connie Draper's slide for this, where she showed us the massive change that particularly junior women from the beginning of the session to the end of the session, what the change in their force curves were. But I mean, it just makes sense, and everyone who coaches sees it. As you get tired, you start to, maybe you're slouching a little bit, you're not sitting up as tall, not rocking over as well, catches are getting a little slower, things like that start to happen. And so the reality is when that technique breaks down and you're taking bad strokes and you still have another half an hour of even, throwing at 18 strokes a minute, put myself on the spot, at 600 strokes that you're going to take, that's bad, at 18 strokes a minute, something like that. So if you're taking bad strokes, your body doesn't just learn when you want it to learn, it learns with everything that you're doing. So if I take as many bad strokes as I take good strokes, my likelihood of developing a good pattern and not developing bad patterns, not very good. And we know that learning and acquiring skill, which is ultimately what we're trying to do, is impaired when we're fatigued. So those strokes, once we're tired and we're not, and we're kind of struggling to get them through, we're probably not helping in our case when we're trying to drive skill acquisition. So how do we do it? We keep focus on quality, limit the duration of pieces to manageable chunks. So this is like, take your 2 kilometer pace and do it for 500 meters. Stop, take a rest, and then do it again. So you can get way more than 2 kilometers worth of work done at your pace by breaking into manageable chunks. Then you never get to the point where, if you did 2 by 2K, probably a couple hundred meters of that at least is going to be pretty broken down technically. And then we stop when it breaks down. So again, a risk is, again, we delay that extensive training. But the risk of the opposite is that you could take as many or more bad strokes as good ones. We ultimately don't get the myelination of the nervous system into the pattern that we want, and which makes it easier and makes it require less energy to execute that skill. And even that delay in extensive training, I think if we follow these principles, you end up, maybe the first few months is not as effective as if you just get into training hard right away. But I think you overtake everybody else pretty quick when you've set a really strong foundation, because the training, every minute of training after that becomes so much more effective than it would have been had you not put some of these things in place. So just to finish up, how are we actually doing some of this? So whenever we're talking about our program, even the physiology side, it's the technical excellence is the driver. So that means when we talk about how many intervals do we do, it's driven by how many intervals can they do with technical excellence. If they could do 8, we don't necessarily want to stop at 6, because that's not challenging them to get better. But if they can do 8, we don't want them to do 12 for the sake of doing 12, because those last 4 are not helping us get to where we want to be. So we use something called the rate speed assessment. So it's taking their speeds at different set rates. So they do a 2 kilometer, so every 500 meters they change, and then in the last 500 it's 2 250s. And we look at, based off of their speed at 18, when they go to a 20 or a 22 or a 24, etc., do they actually increase the speed of the boat when they increase the stroke rate, or do they just take more strokes to go the same speed? And then we use that to actually set some of the stroke rates and look at the areas where, if an athlete is really good up to a 26 and then at 32, they're not really any faster than at 26, then we'll work at that 26, and maybe at times we'll do a little bit above that to help work in that area. But we keep the quality high by using that rate speed assessment to evaluate what they can actually do well and where is the pattern strong still, and then that's where we work. We want to develop an understanding of the athletes of their target speeds. So it's not necessarily world best time speeds for a new athlete, but they need to know what fast actually is. And then we provide opportunities where they can effectively work towards that. So if I tell someone who's maybe capable of 92% of world's best time or GMS over 2 kilometers to race 2 kilometers today, or we're doing 6x2K, they're not going to hit those speeds. They can't. Otherwise, they would be in the national team training center and winning us medals. But maybe they can do it for 250 meters. Maybe they can do it for 300, right? So we do put in smaller chunks where we ask them to maybe work at a speed above the speed that they're currently capable of doing for 2 kilometers. And again, for a junior athlete, it may be, just 5% faster than what they're currently able to do over 2 kilometers. It doesn't necessarily have to be off of those high standards. We do a significant amount of cross training for the extensive work, so particularly coming out of the lockdown, the shutdown, back to rowing. We're still, even though people would love to be rowing 2 or 3 times a day just because they missed it so much, we're doing a lot of the volume on the bike or running, because I don't really care if their technique breaks down at the end of a 2-hour bike ride. I do care if they spend half an hour rowing bad. And then we have sessions that are clearly laid out to work on technique, where they're able to stop for 15, 20 minutes and do stationary drills, or very coach intensive technical drilling, not necessarily about also trying to change their physiology at the same time. And then we try to carry those learnings into their higher intensity work. I'm just going to quickly show what 6 weeks of training is looking like right now for some of the NextGen hubs. So the first week, did a short-ish C6 row just to get the bodies moving. Always challenging the first session of the week to maybe execute perfectly. So it's just kind of a low coaching intensive, get out and get moving, get your body going. And then they come back for a second session and do that rate speed assessment, which is going to inform the next 2.5 weeks of training. I'm just gonna go through a week because it basically follows the same pattern. They do a C6 row, which is, again, technically coaching intensive. So they do maybe 15 minutes rowing, 15 minutes drilling, 15 minutes rowing, something like that. And then they're doing a big 2 to 3 hour cross train. So this is directed at the under 23 university age athletes. So would scale back obviously for juniors. If you add up these total times, it might be a bit heavy. And then Wednesday they had this moderate to high intensity row. So in this block, this is actually what it looks like is a rate pyramid. And those rates are coming directly out of what they achieved in their rate speed assessment on the first day. So some of the athletes, maybe the highest rate they're touching is 22, and other athletes are getting up to a 28-30. So it's a little bit different, but the goal within that session week to week is to get a little bit faster at those set rates, and kind of compete against themselves. They stack that with their S&C. On Thursday, they've got just an easy row or an easy cross train, kind of recovering from that hard Wednesday. On Friday, they come back for another hard day. So this high intensity row, as you see down here, had we not been coming off of a layoff, would be targeted at those things like hitting the speeds, the target speed. So if this was maybe a normal summer and this was the U23 summer program, it would be about the speeds we expect them to have to race at, and trying to do quality work there, and then trying to extend either the length of the interval that they can maintain that speed for. So in week 1, maybe they can hold it for 500 meters. Okay, next week, can we stretch it out to 600, 700? How far can we take it before we start to see speed drop off? But the concept is there's a minimum acceptable threshold of quality, and we want to do how much work can we do above that threshold. And then when the work starts to drop below that quality, we cut the session off. And the goal week to week is to extend the amount of time we spent above that threshold. On Saturday is just a aerobic volume day. So a longer row, another long cross train. So it's a 4-hour day, and it builds up to a 4.5 hour the next week. But the other thing that are experimenting with, is rather than like a 3-week build, a 1 week down, we've put in this idea of a 3.5 day rest period at the end of the 3rd week. So the quality and the focus on quality in all of these sessions is really high. So it's a high cognitive load on the athletes as well. But it's also a fair amount of work. So we're giving them, the idea is that we give them this big chunk of rest and recovery time to consolidate the skill and the learning that they've done, to physically recover, to mentally get a bit of a break, and then they come back into another pretty hard week. So the first week of the second 3-week chunk is pretty hard as well, and it's actually just building off of where we were. So why this kind of made sense to me, and it did come from a conversation with speed skating and how they program, is in that kind of 3-week build, 1 week down model. We're saying in that 1 week down, we need that down week because we're tired and we need to recover. So you would almost expect the quality, or that they're in that fatigue state that we said wasn't good for learning. And if we're trying to drive technical development here and skill development, spending a week where we're supposed to be recovering while we're also driving that learning doesn't necessarily make as much sense as, can we get a higher density of rest and recovery and have them come back in so that every session they take is about driving an improvement in what they're able to do. And there isn't like this week that's supposed to be helping them recover, and that like by the end of the week they're recovered, but they've done this whole week in an unrecovered state where we've said they need recovery. So we are experimenting. It just makes sense to me, so we're trying it. I'm not necessarily saying that this is what we're going to do forever going forwards, but it made sense, so we're going to try it. We'll see if we get a little bit more development than we thought or think we've gotten in the past. But this is what a 6-week big aerobic block right now in the summer about, driving technical excellence, and it's all about how well they're rowing and how well they're doing things, and that's the real driving point. And cognizant that we're well over our time, so we'll end it there. No, sorry, one more slide. So, I mean, this concept came out of actually a different slide. Hope, I don't know what's going on here. But some of the next steps, so there might be some more webinars, hopefully, where I think we need to build off of this foundational piece, creating the right environment for skill development, and then building to the appropriate training loads for high performance is another area that we've discussed. Maybe we need to share what that looks like. And then the process of when we're doing enough training, using testing and a gap analysis process to target training, to address the gaps, and then repeating that process. So maybe some future webinars to hopefully look forward to.
Jordan, thank you. Lots of information there. And also to Dane, thank you very much. Lots going on in different clubs, and it's the right time to really be focusing on this stuff. And it's incredibly satisfying as a coach to see this happen and have the time to make it happen right now. I was thinking people are asking for the slides, a link to the slides, so I will ask Stephen about that. And also, Jordan, perhaps we should share the rate speed assessment chart so that we can start giving that a try. Because there was a question coming in, when somebody's learning really quickly, you start to increase the intensity and you start to increase rates perhaps too quickly. So that the speed assessment chart really is a good indicator on when to in the tiers to rep when increase rate. And I think we're over time, so we have a few questions. Is it? I'm not sure if we lose it, but one question: strong catches or weak catches in build, Dane, and probably when we're talking about the 0 to 100%, I would say it's not a hatchet catch, it's not a duster, it's just a knife cutting the cake, and that's a catch, and then that's the build to the 100%. Really great thing that I've tried. It's like teaching tennis, an hour on, an hour off on land, an hour on, an hour and off. So, or 45 minutes on, 45 minutes off. So little bits at the beginning. So they're back on the dock. and then they get back in the boat, back and forth, and it's a great way for somebody to learn at the beginning. Anything else to add, the two of you? Okay, I think what we'll do is sign off at this point. Thanks to everybody. It is recorded if you want to get some of your other coaches to have a look at what was given today, and we'll carry on. I'm sure there's lots more webinars to develop these topics further. So thanks to both of you and to everybody who was able to join us today. Enjoy being back on the water. Take care. Bye-bye.